And he said that, he asked Jimmy that. He said, Jimmy, what is this? When Jimmy was teaching the technique, he said, Jimmy, what is this technique? And Jimmy said, that's Tsoi-Ga. So what did Carl do? He wrote down Tsoi-Ga number 1, Tsoi-Ga number 2, Tsoi-Ga number 3. And he learned these as, and Jimmy had them classified as Tsoi-Ga for whatever reason. Carl believed that it was emphasized that the Tsoi family had the most influence on that lesson. It wasn't only Tsoi-Ga, it was Tsoi Lei Ho, but the main influence came from that family, but the rest of the technique and the rest of the form of the lesson was all three. All three families had influence on it, and probably Fut from the monastery. See, so the whole thing was developed as a whole. Liga, there was a set of Liga techniques, and I was asked him the same question. Hoi-Ga, or Ho-Ga, which is Ho family, same thing, okay? And I looked at these techniques, and I asked him, and he said, yeah. He said they're all three families, but there's a main emphasis of one family predominantly with these sets. And I said, so what's the difference between Fut'Ga and these techniques? He says they're all Fut'Gas. He said they were all from the monastery. The term Fut'Ga means Buddha community, Buddha family, Buddha collection of things. You know, because that's really what Ga means. It means a collection of something, a family of ideas, a community of people, a community of concepts, right? That's what Ga means, community or family. It doesn't mean like a lineage of people, it just means a collection of things that all relate to one another. They're all related, right? So, Fut'Ga techniques would be the techniques from the monastery, the techniques that the monks developed. Tsoi Lei Ho techniques are the techniques that the monks developed. Tsoi-Ga, Liga, Hoi-Ga, they're the techniques that the monks developed. So we can try to categorize everything. I asked Carl, well, how do I categorize this and how do I look at this? He said they're all Fut'Ga techniques. He said Jimmy said this and this and this, but he said they are all Fut'Ga techniques. I said, okay. So to me, I look at these techniques. We've studied all the Tsoi-Ga techniques within the last 5 years. The Ligas, the Hoi-Gas. We did all this. We're going through Fut'Ga techniques that are actually within like 130, 140 technique set that I have right now that were taught by Jimmy in like the late 60s, maybe early 70s, around that time period. There's like 130 techniques. That's where the Tsoi-Ga, Liga, and Hoi-Ga techniques are in his notes. But they're intermixed within that whole set of Fut'Ga techniques. On the same page, it says Fut'Ga number something, and then it says Ho-Ga number something, right above it. And that's what had me confused at first when I looked at the notes. But it was his way of saying, okay, this is where this fits within these Fut'Ga lessons. Because he had asked Jimmy, he says, oh, those are the monastery, those are the monks' lessons, those are Fut'Gas. So he wrote them down as those, as a collection, and then had the individual families for certain lessons that were in there. And if you look at it, it's very hard to discern what would make it different. You know what I mean? Because they're all Fut'Gas. So if you really look at it in that way, you're better off. Okay? So I think what I'm just trying to say is the Fut'Ga techniques are all part of what happened in the monastery. The Tsoi Lei Ho families are the Fut'Ga techniques. You know? Okay. Carl was told by Jimmy that at one point in time, a long time ago, that the Chinese military was protecting the monastery with their armies. So they had masses of armies and they had infantry. What it was the monks were being attacked by bandits and by rebels and by stuff like that, and the monks needed to have protection because they had to go from town to town. They had to, they were priests and they were also, for medicinal purposes, they were there for the people. But the Chinese military protected them in exchange for them teaching them Kung Fu. So the monks taught the military their Kung Fu, and the armies protected the monks as an army around the monastery and in between there in town and so forth. Okay, so therefore it became a military art at that point. Now, the art changed at that point. It wasn't the monk's art. It became more of a combative art. It became more fighting, just hardcore fighting.
Like Navy SEAL kind of stuff compared
Probably.
to yeah. What we do.
And I mean, that could have been some of the num-pai techniques and some of the more aggressive striking techniques that we have in the art. Possibly, I don't know. I don't know if that was part of the monk's art or not. But that's a good point, because yeah, at one point that art was given to the military and it made a transition. Then they were using those weapons with the Kung Fu in combat out there, being trained under the monks. But the way the monks would have used their weapons probably would have been different than how the army used it. Okay. But I just wanted to point out that the Fut'Ga techniques and the Tsoi Lei Ho techniques are the same. That's what they are. And it's just, that's why the art is Tsoi Lei Ho Fu. That is the original art. And those books are Tsoi Lei Ho Fu Kung Fu books. And whatever else is still in those books, nobody knows, and nobody has probably learned. J.P. King, Jimmy's grandson, is in possession of them. Carl told me that he had talked to JP just recently, and they're falling apart. The books are just falling apart. The pages are coming apart. And the writing is very, very tiny. The calligraphy is also the ancient calligraphy, very complicated. And mostly, the only people that can't read that is people from Taiwan or highly educated people from China, that have gone to college and learned the ancient tongue, the ancient language. But who that knows Sansu, knows how the art works, has been trained, and knows the language, and knows the cultural interpretation of the characters. Because I'm sure that those characters were expressive, like the tiger springing from the grass to consume the crane, in the misty morning or whatever, and that meant something. That meant something specific for a Kung Fu set of ideas. And that's a lot of times how they didn't say, step to your right front quarter with your right foot and do a left backhand to the throat. That's not how they expressed it. So, I don't even know if anybody could look in those and make anything out of it at this point. Jimmy knew how to read them, and nobody else that I know. So, from what Carl said, is they should be laminated, and they should be put into a museum. And they should be in some sort of an ancient Chinese exhibit to where they can be protected, they can be preserved, and given the respect for what they are. And so that they don't just fall apart and disintegrate. Okay? But this brings us to what I was going to talk about tonight with the technique itself. We're going through these Fut'Ga techniques, and again, they're the set of the Tsoi Lei Hos that I have as well. So, Fut'Ga, Tsoi Lei Ho, synonymous. Okay? We were talking about angles. Let's go back to this diagram again.